Okay, quick intro before we get into this podcast. This one's a bit unusual compared to my normal content. It's a response to Christianity Today's Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. And I don't normally do these current event type things, but as I was talking with these two friends over text about this podcast, it felt like there was a good amount of overlap with the things I'm trying to talk about here at Hungry Theologian. See, the embodied Christian life that I'm trying to promote in my cooking videos needs to be applied to every area of life. And so there's going to be times on my podcast where I branch out from talking about food specifically because the values that I'm trying to teach in the food videos are a really helpful lens for some other conversations like the one we're having today. So this is how all my content fits together. The food and cooking videos are at the center, and those aren't going anywhere. In a world of digital devices, cooking and eating are important ways that we can encounter God, enjoy his creation, and learn to live an embodied faith. So I've got some great ideas lined up for 2022, and I have a big announcement related to my cooking videos that I hope to make soon. The podcast has two emphases that branch out from the cooking videos. It's both a way to go deeper into the things I talk about in those videos, and it's a way to apply the values of Hungry Theologian to other areas of life, particularly through conversations with others. And then lastly, my newsletter is a place for me to think out loud about some ideas that are less developed and share some links that I think you should pay attention to. Hopefully that gives you some good framing for why this conversation is happening, but also how all the different content I'm producing fits together. Oh, and this conversation was edited a little bit for length and clarity, but I'm going to release the unedited version of the conversation with another 30 minutes or so as an exclusive for my Patreon supporters. So if you want to hear that, go check it out at patreon.com/hungrytheologian. Now let's get on to the podcast. Okay, welcome back to the Hungry Theologian podcast. I'm here today with two of my friends, Douglas and Seth, who were both part of Mars Hill Church in Seattle at its peak for a time. And we've had some conversations about the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. And there are some elements of this that I think really overlap with the perspectives that I'm trying to build in what I do here with Hungry Theologian and thinking about an embodied faith and what that looks like lived out in all of our lives. So I thought it'd be interesting for us to just record a little bit of response to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast, and then hopefully from there get into some of these other issues that Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll and this podcast raise. So just to start off, what drew you guys to Mars Hill when you went there?
I'll say I was certainly conscious of who Mark Driscoll was. I went to a Bible college before that. In fact, John MacArthur's Bible college. So I already had some kind of opinions in my head about what this was all about. When I started going to Mars Hill, I had also moved up to Seattle, like just before that. I will say, like, I didn't move up to Seattle to attend Mars Hill Church. It just kind of happened that way. What specifically drew me to Mars Hill is honestly that I was in a new town starting fresh, and that's where friends happened. And I'll credit this other guy here who is much better at making new friends than I am. That he, and I'll let him get to his part of the story, was already moving up there to be part of at least part of that church, but he got a lot more plugged in with community groups. And I, to be honest, mooched off of that and started joining some of those community groups as well. And sure enough, from there, like, I met a lot of really cool people, and I mean, I wanted friends. And then I started going to the church a little bit more. And there's a lot in this podcast where they talk about how Mark was trying to target young, aimless men. And at that time, I totally was. And so there's part of that where it was speaking to me. And especially as somebody who grew up in the church and was used to very boring church sermons and really not interested in all, it was at least a weird breath of fresh air that, like, hey, if I already feel a responsibility to attend church, let me at least go to one that's slightly more interesting. Like, they relate him to Mark to being like more of like an insult comic. I'm like, sure, I'd rather go to an insult comics church service than like a boring old one I'm used to. So it kind of at least started to, it started with that. And honestly, I wasn't necessarily thinking more deeply than that. I had certainly had some reservations on Mark's views of women and a little bit of that. But to be honest, I mean, I learned so much even just from this podcast that I didn't know about backstory before that. So plenty of ignorance too, but it was a lot of just for the practical reasons of the practical things that a large church offers.
Yeah, I appreciate that story, and we moved up to Seattle together, but I definitely, I was a true believer. So as I think both you guys know, and, reflecting and looking back, there's a lot of mixed emotions about that, but I knew of Mark and Mars Hill because I had a friend who lived in Seattle, a friend that I grew up with and moved there years past. And so maybe a few years earlier in college, I started listening to his sermons, and I think really felt, captivated by them. And at the time, I think I'm still processing what I think now, but at the time would have said I felt that he, expressed the gospel in a clear way, in a new way, in a way that resonated with me, and felt more convicted of my sins in different ways, and even in a positive sense to then like repent and move forward. And there was then also this friend connection, and so I would visit, and he had a positive, community experience. I knew that there was some meat to it beyond just the sermon from a dude on a screen, because I had a friend who lived there and went to the UW district, and had, those are some of his greatest church memories. He spoke very fondly of the church. So from a distance, it just seemed like this really great thing. And so I actually, I was going through some things in my faith at that time already. And then when I graduated undergrad, they had a seminary program that you could apply for as part of the Resurgence. And so I applied for that and got accepted. And so that's sort of what, for me, was like, okay, I'm moving to Seattle, and so I'm going to do the Resurgence seminary program and, get involved in one of the local campuses. It ended up being the UW, so it ended up being the Bellevue location for us, and then, joining a small group, becoming a small group leader. But yeah, there was definitely a, like Seth, you mentioned, like aimless men that somehow, and Mark did kind of resonate too. And I also identify with that because, I had a college degree, but I didn't have a career, and I didn't know what I was doing, and, had this fancy engineering degree, and I was working in retail, and really just had no idea how the world worked really, or how to like navigate those things. And a lot of those things were not modeled well for me by my father. And so I think there were a lot of father wounds that was unspoken or even just unknown that was going on. And so having a guy say, hey, you need to like figure out how to get a job and, make money if you want to ever have a family, but you need to like do these practical things. Yeah, it was somehow both interesting and felt like what I needed to hear.
Shifting to the podcast specifically now, how did this podcast line up with your guys' experience of Mars Hill?
I'll say for the most part, it did a decent job, mostly because, like, as I explained a little bit in the beginning, like I already had a little bit of a distance. Like there's part of me that I already kind of knew, like Mark Driscoll's kind of a dick. And like, I already kind of came in with that reservation of like, okay, like pro wrestling is also a little ridiculous. I'm not going to take it at face value per se. I mean, all I could say is nobody really ever did me wrong, and at least on the surface per se. And so in a way, right, all this damage and all this manipulation was mostly to people who were far more victimized than I ever was. And so I do want to make that clear, that everything that I'm saying is coming through the context of somebody who had a pretty okay experience. And that doesn't mean that mine should be, my opinion should be probably way less than theirs. But for the most part, like I said, the individual community group that I had was great. I mean, I never knew Mark Driscoll personally. I never met the guy personally. And that's, I think, some of what your later questions are going to get to, is maybe that's part of the problem. But because of that, I can therefore have a little insulation that I can have a pretty decent time, even having no idea that some of these other things are going on.
I think for me, and listening to the podcast, I'll clarify this, is the church, Mars Hill, I think is, at least my perspective, is a mixed bag, good and bad. But what has been sobering and sad is like Mark Driscoll himself is like pretty overwhelmingly bad. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of layers of manipulation and stuff like that. And I think what I'm maybe most embarrassed about is like how I didn't see that, right? And so like that's, you kind of said like going into, you're like, I kind of see that as a did, right? You were like more alert, like more aware, and I was more sucked in and like, I don't know, he's funny, or you know, he's saying what needs to be said or whatever. Like I really was a true believer, and I think that's what I'm like most embarrassed about, or most like ashamed of, or I don't know, or feel like yapping, you know. I think I'm processing, because it's like, well, how much, if I like Mark, how much of Mark is in me, right? Like how much, it's easy to just point the finger, but then it's like, oh, why was I kind of taken by that? So I met Mark a few times. I don't know him, but because at the seminary program, he would teach us and he would talk with us. So I met him a few times, had a few conversations with him. I still am like trying to figure out what is going on in his head to be able to preach the things he preached and then treat people the way he treated them. And not that, certainly we can, there's all kinds of issues with preaching as well. And the podcast talks about what gospel did he preach, and that was really good as well. But yeah, I think that's still difficult for me to wrap my mind around, to be honest. Like it still hurts kind of, and I'm figuring out what that is.
And I mean, that really speaks to the modern phenomenon of deconstruction, which I think I want to try to come back to if we have time in this conversation, because I think this podcast is really interesting fodder for that. I mean, they had on Josh Harris specifically talking about deconstruction and, his whole back and forth with doing an online course on how to deconstruct your faith. But let's come back to that. Let's stick with sort of the meta analysis of the podcast. So what do you think Christianity Today wants people to take away from this podcast, especially listening to the final episode as they've sort of wrapped up this narrative?
Certainly the last episode, I will say that shifted my perspective. I was way more negative on them leading up to that last podcast, because the Josh Harris episode that you mentioned, like I couldn't see how they would ever take any more conclusion from it than, well, it's just a bad apple, and that just happens, and we'll just be a little tougher on it next time, but ultimately what can you do? And like they'll never, and for the most part, I don't really think that they necessarily did even go deeper into, maybe our theology is a little bad, maybe we've created systems that allow this to happen, and like corrupt systems exist. And so I was pretty not expecting them to go any deeper than that. And I will say, in fairness, like I thought the last episode did a much better job for a number of reasons of trying to at least do a little bit more of that. Now, I'm still not satisfied that they went far enough in some ways, as far as like really questioning themselves. But I think, I don't know whether it's CT or Mike Cosper himself who was leading the charge, I think they did a much better job of saying there are victims from this that have gone in so many directions, and they're in so many different places now. And it's not for us to go in and say they need to all come back to Christianity right now, or they need to come back at our speed that we want them to. And so I was pleasantly surprised that that's the vibe I got from it at the end, that they were a little bit more maybe okay with saying we just need to let these people share and let these people heal and not get in the way of that. And I thought that was a much better message to end it on.
I don't think Christianity Today is ready to go this far, but it's like, yeah, there are deeply unbiblical things in evangelicalism, right? These things that are just like, they're not only not Christian, they are actively anti-Christian. So one of the things that I'm playing around with is, this idea of a celebrity pastor. I actually have, and I didn't see it at the time. Certainly, I wish we have a friend that called this out years ago, and I didn't see it at the time. But now I look at it and I'm like, I think the idea of a celebrity pastor is like anti-Christ. It's fine to be a celebrity and it's fine to be a pastor, but if your pastorship is what gives you your celebrity, that is like the opposite of what Christ did. This is not what Christ did, right? Because when Christ had the opportunity for celebrity, he left the crowd. He made himself less, right? Because of this mission. Like, it doesn't mean you can't speak to a large crowd. It doesn't mean you can't have influence or whatever. But this idea that your eldership, your pastorship in a church gives you clout and a celebrity status, I think is deeply anti-Christ and anti-Christian. Yeah, because I just think to the part in the podcast when the one guy said, the wolf is loose in the sheep pen. And certainly that was the case with Mark Driscoll and how he abused people. But I think that's the case with so many other Christian leaders. And I mean, it's easy to just look at the news for that. But even beyond the headline, even beyond Ravi Zacharias or other, big scandals, just looking at the culture that we've created, which is a consumer culture. It is the sage on the stage has all the answers. And these things don't happen by accident. They don't happen out of a vacuum. They happen in unhealthy systems. And I think these are unbiblical systems. And I think it's deeply troubling and deeply related to the state of the church and even the culture, broadly speaking, in this country, which is troubling.
So I did a little searching on Twitter to try to see what's the overall vibe on this podcast and how are people responding to this? Because I've talked to people in my own circles, but how are people more broadly responding to this podcast? And there were two really common critiques that I saw, and they were opposite critiques. The two most common critiques of this podcast. So on one side, it was people saying, you're trying to pin everything Mark Driscoll did on complementarianism and Reformed theology and all of that. And you're saying that everything he did is tied up with this theological view, but that's wrong, because obviously there's all these healthy churches or healthier churches that have similar theological views. And then the flip side of that critique, the other most common critique, is people from the other side saying, how come you're not pinning everything Mark Driscoll did on complementarianism and Reformed theology, and you're letting all of these people off the hook who are holding this abusive theology, just like Driscoll did? I'm doing the caricatures of these critiques, but it was fascinating to me that those were the most common critiques and they're opposite critiques. So, people listened to the exact same podcast and came away with the exact opposite opinion, that you did too much of this or you didn't do enough of this. And I think part of what that speaks to is that there's something in our culture that just wants to stay at this level of ideas. Like, let's say whether the theology was true or not. And actually what's happening here is there's theology and there's the sociology of it and the culture and people's practices and the way this church functioned and the sort of culture that people were brought into and expected to conform to in the church. And there's all of these other layers. And it's not just at this level of ideas, like did they have the right theology or the wrong theology about this? And like the theological level is important, and maybe that's one of the levels that should be talked about here. But I feel like these two critiques of, you either pin too much on Reformed theology or you didn't pin enough on Reformed theology, are sort of too narrow in their focus, and they're coming out of this narrow focus on ideas when actually there's a lot more we need to talk about. And, like Douglas is gesturing at, if we want to assess what this should mean for the American church moving forward, it's got to be about a lot more than just getting the right ideas in our heads.
Yeah, I agree. And certainly, people go into this not necessarily, like most people, I don't think are willing to change their mind on a lot of things. And so certainly they would go into this and see what they want to see. They gather the supporting data for it. And then they're like, sure, the conclusion I already thought happened. Sure enough, it happened because I went looking for those exact things. And that's just a humanity problem. But you're totally right. If there was one takeaway of this, it's just that there are so many more causes for this than just that. Because I'm sure there's plenty of complementarian churches that are unhealthy and we just don't know it. And I'm sure that'll come out over time, but there may be some that are. And so it's, like you said, it's way more nuanced than that. There's way more than simple answers are just not going to do for something like this, especially for something that can be so popular as Mars Hill was. Like there's a million reasons people went there, a million reasons that people didn't speak up enough or stayed with it or were kind of part of the problem. And so, the answer's just got to be more nuanced than that. Not saying I know what all these answers are. I took a lot of notes. I have some thoughts, but don't know them all.
On this note of trying to think about the future of the church, is a podcast like this good for the church? Because this is sort of one of the other conversations around this podcast. People have called it failure porn and said, everyone just wants to stop and look at the car crash.
I think we have to acknowledge that, like CT picked the juiciest story, maybe, right? That they're like, if we're going to do one, let's do the Mars Hill one, because Mark Driscoll was so prolific in just not only having so many sermons out there, which, my God, Mike Cosper having to listen to so many of those, I can't even imagine. But also, like, Mark Driscoll was intentionally trying to cross the line. So you have so many things you can point to, like, that's disgusting, that's disgusting. And it's just more subtle with the people that have fallen that are a little bit more subtle with how they did it. So we have to acknowledge that it's a little self-serving. At the same time, I don't see how the answer is anything but, yeah, this podcast was at least good for part of the process. Like, deconstruction is a thing now. A lot of people are doing it. I only learned about the term maybe a couple of years ago, but I feel like that is at least closer describing me than a lot of other things have been. And something needs to be said about that is actually constructive. That's not just like, I can't believe all these people left the church. Like, what the hell are they thinking? We have to come to it more intelligently than that. And part of that is being authentic and actually digging into it and hearing what these people have to say. And that's the only way to ever even have a conversation like this. Like, the people, the victim stories needed to be heard on this. And in fact, there's probably needed to be more of that in the podcast. I'm glad they threw a bunch in at episode 12, but there probably should have been even more even before that. And so that's what needs to happen, because otherwise people aren't changing their mind, and maybe they will if they actually have to hear some of these stories. But as far as someone who has a complicated relationship with the church, one of the only ways that it could kind of ever entice me back in was by being way more honest than they've ever been about things like this.
I think there's a lot of fear that people have in things being exposed and having these sorts of hard conversations. And I think it's a similar fear that people have in, say, if you're, listening to a lot of philosophers that are atheists, or, in some churches, a fear of, going into science and really trying to understand the world in that way. And I think this fear, to me, that fear is just a lack of trust in God as the one who's really supreme and really everything we believe about him is true. Like, I don't have fear of someone exploring truth, even if it looks like that exploration is taking them away from the church, because I personally think that if anyone is exploring truth, it's going to end up at Jesus. And so, like, when I was in campus ministry and people who weren't Christians would be sort of interested, one thing I said sometimes is, pick your 3 favorite religions. Let's say Christianity is one of them, pick 2 other religions and just learn as much as you can about those 3 religions. And I really think if people are genuinely exploring truth, they're going to end up at Jesus. And so I'm not afraid of them diving deeply into understanding Islam or Buddhism or anything else, because I think the genuine search for truth is going to end up at Jesus. But I think there's a lot of fear people have that may not be the case. And it's analogous, I think, to this fear that if we talk about the ways the church went wrong, then people are going to leave and this whole thing will fall apart.
And Jesus doesn't need like that level of defending. Like Mark Driscoll had all these like wartime metaphors, like we need to be an army, and like Jesus doesn't need us to like, oh, I gotta go defend the guy. Like he'll be just fine.
Yeah.
Oh, but it's more they're doing it, like you said, out of fear, because at some point the church is a representation of them and they're feeling personally attacked because Jesus is getting attacked, and that's why they're defending it, not because for Jesus' sake, but for their own sake.
I want to come back to the deconstruction stuff, but first I want to get into some of these disembodiment things that I was sort of pushing on a little bit in our conversations. So as Mars Hill grew, Mark became essentially a disembodied pastor. That he was preaching on video for the vast majority of the people who were hearing him. I guess he was in one place live, right? And it would be video to the rest of the locations. Is that how that worked?
Correct.
So for most of the people who are hearing him preach, it's on video. And because of the size of the church, he doesn't have relationships with the majority of the people in the church. And this dynamic of a disembodied pastor seems inevitable if you're going to go the mega church route. I don't see any way you can be a mega church that large and have the pastor actually have meaningful embodied relationships with everyone who's a part of the church. So one question I want to ask about this is the disembodiment of Mark Driscoll's ministry and the megachurch model a part of the problem here? And I have a bias here because my whole YouTube channel, my brand here with Hungry Theologian is all about a very embodied faith. You know, I'm trying to get people to cook and eat because I think embodiment is so central to the Christian faith. So I'll just lay my bias on the table that I think embodiment is pretty important. But I'm curious what you guys think. Is the disembodied pastor part of the problem here?
I mean, unquestionably, yes. I'll take it, way much further. Like, should we have mega churches? Should we have main preaching pastors? I feel pretty strongly so far that probably the answer is no. And we should maybe get rid of all of that because it is one of the major problems. It feels contrary to any part of the church model, because it's not about the sermon in and of itself. It's not about a performance. And at some point, when you get so disembodied, like, why don't I just listen to a podcast instead? Why don't I just come and sit in my church and just put on somebody else in my ear and just listen to that the whole time? At that point, it becomes replaceable. And certainly the COVID thing has shown me more of that, where there's just been so much distance, and we see it kind of play out of, could we even do this thing as a distance church thing? And kind of the answer, I think, to that is also to no. Like, there's so many things that are lost with doing distance church. So absolutely, it's part of the problem, and we need to do away with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also biased because you've convinced this embodiment idea that you've talked about, right? You've certainly convinced me as we've talked over the years and stuff. But also, just what Seth was saying is so spot on. For there to be progress and healing, we need an embodied faith. And also, like with church and COVID and things, if you can do church on a screen or on a podcast or on a live video, that's not church. Like, that's a cool lecture, that's a fun seminar, that's maybe a worship service, maybe. But worship is our lives. Worship is so much more than singing, and the church is so much more than a lecture. And so much of Paul's writings are all about interrelational stuff. Like, you cannot really follow or listen to Paul, who's echoing Jesus, if you're not in like deeper, smaller group, like continual relationships. And I understand that the small group is what megachurches try to do to fill this gap. And it's like, oh yeah, we have a message, and then you have the small group communities. I think there are a number of problems with that model. Not that there are benefits to it, but overall, I don't think it works. Maybe it's better than no small groups. Yeah, sure, I'd agree with that. And I don't know if we want to go on that rabbit trail, but one thing I will say, one of the often with these mega church small groups, the problem that I see is the group is focused around the sermon and the preaching, not around scripture. Not it's the questions are the point that the pastor made last Sunday, not what do we observe from the text. And it's subtle and it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal.
I totally agree. I mean, just on that last point, I think a lot of churches, I mean, few of the church settings I've been in have been settings that I felt like taught people how to read the Bible and how to understand the Bible. Most of the church settings that I've been in my lifetime have been teaching people, this is what the Bible says versus this is how you read and understand the Bible. And that's a big problem. And, you know, with something like Mars Hill, everything is so neatly packaged and well designed. I mean, the media side of Mars Hill was top notch. I think you guys would probably agree. I mean, they had people at the top of their craft in video, audio, music, visual arts, graphic design, all of these things. I mean, top notch. And there are very few Christian settings I've seen reach that level of production and craft. Now, maybe this is all part of the problem because you can only do that on some level with a megachurch budget. But another side of it where I was going with that is that in Mars Hill, you know, everything is so nicely packaged. It's very easy to receive the package and just take it for what it is, rather than going down that more difficult route of asking some of these fundamental questions of looking, how do we actually read the Bible? How did we come to these sorts of conclusions? Asking questions of the packaged thing that's been handed to you versus just sort of receiving this nicely packaged set of ideas.
That part of Mars Hill was a breath of fresh air. And it was compared to, you know, the just, you know, typeface fiasco like bulletins of the 1990s and just what most churches were doing at the time. That part it felt cool and it felt practically cool, like useful. And the art was good, the music was good, the communication, you know, they're one of the first churches to be on iTunes, to be on YouTube, podcast, vodcast. And that was very creative and done at a very high level. But one of the things that was also interesting that came out via the podcast was you realize it was sort of this luck or serendipity or the hand of God. I don't know what you want to call it, but Mark was really surrounded by exceptionally talented people who may not have had the resume, but were just naturally gifted. And they've done amazing things and they did amazing things. To kind of wrap a bow on it, one of the things that was very, in hindsight, I realized was very deceptive was the narrative was this was all Mark. Like Mark was this creative guru that valued music and art and all these things, and his vision and like bringing this vision of creativity in the church and the theological foundation for why this matters and stuff. And what you realize, like, no, it wasn't Mark. It was a lot of talented people around him who read the Bible and believed the value of craft and things. But somehow he co-opted their gifts to kind of just building his platform. And that's what makes it so toxic and so like sad, that ultimately the quality and stuff was used for a bad purpose. And that's, yeah, right. It's, you know, at some point, how many $50,000 cameras does a church need? You know, because that's the other thing. It's one thing to go beyond the PowerPoint $2 really crappy brochure and the crappy website that doesn't work, and then to get a good production camera, whatever. But at some point, well, how good is good enough? And I think the bigger problem is, why is it all about a stage? And one of the like the churches that I visited post Mars Hill, it was frustrating because I could see it. You know, I volunteered for this one church and it was a smaller church, but I could see it in the pastor's eyes and the staff's eyes and all the volunteers. they would never say this, but they wanted to be just like Mars Hill. It was all about how do you elevate the brand, the stage, the package, the thing. So we need better cameras, we need better this. And I'm like, well, wait, I've seen where this goes. I've seen the sum of this game. It doesn't go anywhere good. So why are we, it's very hard for me to be motivated to like help, they're like, yeah, let's help do a better like video production. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think that's what we need to be working on.
And it's tough too, because that's kind of what lured us in and helped us stay too, was our desire for that as well, right? So it's something that we would know, and it's tough to hold that against other people, because truly, like, there's part of you that wants, yeah, let's get Jesus out there even more. But again, like, a lot of the identity has been tied into, I'm a reflection of the church, or the church is of me, or whatever. And somehow that's tied in there. So if the church gains prestige, therefore I gain prestige. And that's totally tied into mega churches and why people go there too, because it is a feather in their cap, I think, even if they're just a simple attender. But it's way too tied in there. And so that's why I think we just get so tempted in all these other ways, because our identity is off.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will add, I don't know exactly where this fits, but I do imagine, one of the college conferences I went to, and this is not Mark preaching, it was some other dude who was an art. They had like a scientist give a talk, and they have like an artist give a talk, and I don't know what this art, but that was very like positive for me and helpful, and like the idea of that it's okay to like care about your craft and quality and things like that, and like the artist, like the theological stuff of the arts and building that, and I think that I think that is a good thing. And that just like in the Old Testament, when God gives the Spirit to what's his name to build the Ark of the, like Moses did not build the Ark of the Covenant, because like Moses don't know graphic design worth shit. Right. So like Moses could be a great leader, but he ain't an artist. He ain't a craftsman, he ain't a designer. So God used the spirit of these other people to actually like build the stuff. And I would certainly love to see a celebration of craftsmen at different levels, because it's not just playing guitar, there's a lot of different things that the body of Christ can contribute to. And a celebration of that, I do think, is positive. But what was ultimately sad and really corrupted Mark. So yeah, it sort of became about that package, and I mean, Seth, you bring up a good point of, well, what we like being part of nice things, and we like just kind of consuming nice things, instead of maybe digging deeper into what does it mean to be quality craftsmen in different aspects of life, and sort of celebrating that God celebrates that as a creator, instead of just building the brand of one person.
What does this mean for the church in the modern world, in the internet age? I mean, since COVID and even pre-COVID, people are watching church online, and that's their experience of going to church is entirely mediated by the screen in front of them. I mean, mega churches are still flourishing. And I don't remember the numbers exactly, but a huge percentage of American churchgoers are part of a mega church. It's I don't want to say the percentage because I don't remember exactly, but it's a large percentage of American churchgoers that are part of a mega church. People are listening to sermons on podcasts, and all of this is becoming sort of people's experience of church. What does that mean for the future of the church? It sounds like all of us are saying this isn't a good thing, but this is becoming more the thing that people are doing.
Yeah, and even to play like the devil's advocate, or the other, and even to try to say, what if the mega church is sincere? What if, or they're trying to be, they're not, they're hard, they don't, it's not a celebrity pastor, it's a mega church, but they have a plurality of leadership to some extent, and they're trying to do these things. You basically just run into limits of that structure and that system. And at least what seems to be biblically, I don't think that system is healthy, because for a mega church to function, you need a consolidation of power at the top, and you need a charismatic speaker, and you need to consolidate some of that packaging and that messaging, and then you can dumb down the rest of the roles. And that even so, why small groups are fine, but they're not great, is because a small group leader is actually doing more pastoring than the pastor. Like he is actually pastoring the people, and yet he is not given that title. He or she is not given that title. They're not given adequate training. They're just kind of thrown at there because the way this model works is their job has to be as easy and dumbed down as possible. And we just have our fancy packaged sermon that all the groups talk about. And that, even in you're trying to do the right thing in the most purest heart of like, I want to follow Jesus and share Jesus with many people, and people like this, and people are going to this. It's not what Jesus said to do. Like, it's just not. Like, Jesus only had 12 disciples. Why do we think we can have 100, 1,000, 10,000, 50,000, whatever? And so there needs to be a more fluidity and dynamic and flatter hierarchy to produce the health that we want to see. And so what, I think it is going to be more and more difficult to follow Jesus. It's always been difficult to follow Jesus. Honestly, I don't know. That's kind of the same, I guess. I probably shouldn't say, I mean, it's always been difficult to really follow Jesus, right? But I think it does make, because culturally we've left Christendom, we've left modernity, we've left all these bastions of evangelicalism, Christianity, whatever. So the culture is becoming less and less church, anti-church, more and more things. So for the people in the traditional church mindset, it totally makes sense that they're going to gravitate toward a mega church because they're feeling attacked, they're feeling threatened, and the little mom and pop church just doesn't have nobody goes there anymore because all the kids left and the old people are dying. And that's, so yeah, the few that remain will then congregate into these mega churches, and those will grow bigger. And if you go to a healthy, I think there are, on the spectrum, there are more and less healthy mega churches. But what I would say, even the most healthy mega church is fundamentally flawed, and it's like not biblical and not really doing what Jesus wants. And so the believers there, amongst the people that are maybe not true believers or whatever, however it works out, they're still going to be capped in their growth. The growth is going to be struggling because it's really not a place that fosters growth or deeper growth.
And it all plays into consumer culture. I mean, it seems to me that it's very non-participatory. It's, let me receive this thing that I want to receive because this is the thing that I, as a consumer, have made the choice that I want to be tuned into.
100%. And that's why it can appeal to so many people, because it doesn't require much of you at all, just other than to just go sit there, give some money, and then just listen and go hang out with people who are kind of just like you. Wow, I can go do that. That's no problem. Right. But it's, I keep trying to think of like, well, what is the solution? And I would love for there to be a way that we could get more checks and balances in here so that we are away from all this non-denominational shit where it's just the free market of church planting, and you can just go plant whatever church you want as long as you have money and people to follow you. But taking it back to like what we've said before, like the core points of Jesus is that the work is tough and you're not going to get much, if any, recognition for it. And that's a message that people really aren't lining up to sign up for. And so therefore true believers in the actual Jesus are going to be in the minority, because that is tough, but it is not only, but it's Christ's message. And that's part of being part of his family, is doing that for the deeper rewards of being part of Christ's family, not just the extrinsic rewards. So as my voice is failing, I'll just cut out there.
No, that's great. I mean, for me, some of those issues are part of why I've moved into the Anglican tradition, because I see these flaws of the non-denominational thing. And I think, wow, we need good authority structures for all the ways, authority structures have obviously gone wrong throughout history. There's a need for good authority structures. And also, the Anglican worship is very embodied. I mean, we're eating and drinking the Eucharist every Sunday, and that's central to what we're doing in worship. And I think that's powerful to move beyond simply the level of ideas.
A narrative that really stood out to me was when I think it was the head of video in the podcast, I think is Jesse or whatever. And when he got fired by Sutton Turner, but really by Mark, I don't know, by the both of them, whatever. Because he didn't like Sutton. He was supposed to back Sutton. And then he's like, nah, I'm not going to do that. And Mark's like, well, you got to go. And there's a little anecdote about when he was let go, he did not have enough money to buy a new laptop. And so this was a guy, video production guy, and his salary was so low that I guess he was living like paycheck to paycheck. And yet Mark is making $650K plus annually. Is just like what you're saying, as like asking people to serve for God, but the leadership is not making the same kind of sacrifices, first of all. And so you've co-opted a lot of things. And I guess just like the level of spiritual abuse that really is like, it's like, that's like really deep. That's like evil. And yeah. And so I guess so the church has had many forms over the history of its 2000-year life. And as it tries to be a city on the hill and tries to reflect God's kingdom, sadly, it instead reflects whatever culture or kingdom it's in. And so I guess what's very painfully obvious through this anecdote is that today's church, it represents a company and a corporation and capitalism. And so there's not even a blink in the eye of maybe we should pay our like media guy more. There's the obvious stuff. Oh, this is bad when this happens. But there's this subtle stuff that's actually like, I think, quite evil and anti-Christ, anti-kingdom. And it just goes on without anyone. They're just like, oh, it's just business as normal, because the church has become business. And so
there is like so many people are the cause of things like this. And there's no way that we can say this is all Mark and try to excuse everybody else. And even though I don't think I actively hurt anyone per se, like I have to reconcile that I too like am part of the problem. And unless we're willing to do that, like nothing changes, because none of us realize that we too will make this happen again in a different context here in the next 20 years or whatever. And so that's what we have to really reconcile with, because it's so dumb that's how they ended the first episode. Maybe we all were to blame, but in a more legitimate sense, we were all part of the problem.
There needs to be an understanding that, yeah, we can look at these failures honestly, because we know that humans are sinful and human sin is going to infect these institutions. And so we need to look at this honestly and own our failures. Well, in our last few minutes here, I want to get on the deconstruction question a little bit, because I think that could be really fruitful. So I'll just lay it out to start. What do you guys think we should make of the deconstruction phenomenon?
We just now have a label for it, but it's been happening for a while. Like people have gotten pissed off at the church because the church does them wrong. And it's just kind of the natural leading thing from that. And so people, they get hurt and they realize this is not what I wanted, or what I wanted is not good. And so like some of that's just natural. And so, yeah, they have to come to terms with it, because like Doug's earlier point of people in other countries that we've been missionaries to, or people here, if all they know is like a corrupted version of the gospel, like, yeah, maybe they get saved because Jesus is actually real and does real work. But there's so much bullshit around it that when that fails, they're just back at square one. And I don't know what to do. So, I mean, it's 100% real and legitimate. And anybody who tries to like diminish that, like that's not the right answer, because this is like that it becomes, and that's my point earlier about the Josh Harris episode where Cosper kind of rails against deconstruction at the end of that. Like we can't go like blaming the victim with this, that suddenly that's your guys' fault that you guys are running away and the church is right. And when you realize that and you come back, like then we can have a conversation. Like that is totally like we've learned so much about, and as a society, about maybe not blaming the victim so much. And so we can't do things like that. So ultimately, I'm happy with the way they kind of ended it. Like again, where he's kind of said people are in a bunch of different directions, and I don't know, we kind of just need to accept them where they are. And Ralph, oh my gosh, your point earlier about if you actually believe Jesus is the truth, like you should have confidence in that. Like that speaks to me. Like that is what I've had in my mind for years now. Like if Jesus is worth a damn and like, and faith means anything, like you can feel free to say, yes, go pursue truth, whoever I care about. And you can have confidence that if they're actually doing that, then if Jesus is actually true, then they'll come back to that. Then like, why are you even worried? And if they don't go back to it and they were pursuing truth and they end up somewhere else, maybe that means maybe I need to acknowledge that maybe I'm not correct then either, because someone is following truth and they found out somewhere else. And maybe I am the one that's wrong. And I don't think a lot of people really want to see it that way.
One of the thoughts I was having, taking the construction metaphor, we have real examples where a house is just in bad shape and you need to take it down to the studs and really rebuild what's there, because there's a lot of damage, there's mold, and you just can't paint over what's happened there. And I think that can be the case for lots of people for many reasons in their experience of the church, that there's just stuff there that you can't just paint over with a fresh coat of paint, that there needs to be some deconstructing on, like I was saying about before, the theological and the sociological levels. This can be, beliefs and at the theological level of ideas, but this can also be sort of the practices and the culture that we get, swept up in particular churches. And there could be things on both of those levels that really need to be deconstructed. So I think I agree with what you're saying, Seth, that this is a phenomenon that it's good that there's some language for, because this can be a very necessary process for people to pick apart things that were actually harmful and incorrect and misleading in their prior church experiences. And yeah, I think in my beliefs, I can have confidence that if they're really doing this in the pursuit of truth, they're going to end up at Jesus, which maybe isn't where they were before.
So one of the stories that I also resonated with, I forget, it was one of the pastors, and he was kind of sharing about he wasn't sure if he was going to be a pastor, because even after Mars Hill, he kind of stated he was kind of this like kind of dead inside, still doing the pastor thing for a number of years after Mars Hill, and finally was like, I need to like step away, right? And then he's still on his journey and figuring out if he's going to return to ministry and all that, and that's fine. But I resonated with that as well, of like this delayed, like, what do I believe and what did I believe and what is true and what isn't, and that stripping down to the studs. And I think he said this on the podcast, and it resonated with me, because for me, it was like everything that I had believed and understood about Christianity and the Bible. And this is going to Christian school, whole life, and different Reformed Baptist influences, some charismatic influences, and going to this seminary program, I like threw all of that away, because I was like, this is all suspect. And the only thing that was still compelling or captivating was like the character and life of Christ, right? And certainly his death, burial, and resurrection is all great. But to me, it was the life of Christ that was compelling. Like it was the life of Christ that made me believe that his death and resurrection are meaningful because of the way he lived. And so with deconstruction, you have to let people do that in their own time and in their own way. And you guys have already said this, but just I'm in another seminary program now, and one of the professors did their PhD on deconversion, people who've left the church. And these aren't just like people, these are like pastors, missionaries who are now, just totally left. And he's done some pretty, deep, like research into the topic. And there's lots of still questions and unknowns. But one of the common things, just to emphasize what both of you said, was that if people are in that deconstructing process, and if you interrupt it and you say, don't do that, come back to church, like, what's wrong with, blah, 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 that almost assuredly will cause them to leave the faith and never come back. It almost assuredly hurts them more. And those that do deconstruct and actually return to the faith overwhelmingly were the ones that were able to like go through that process, and they had people that supported them, that loved them kind of wherever their conclusions may take them, that kind of a thing, instead of if you don't believe this, we're not going to be your family, your community, your church, your whatever. Those are the ones that typically then walked away permanently.
Totally. And I mean, from my personal experience, like throughout maybe multiple deconstructions, like the people that were the most helpful were people like either my most recent pastor and my therapist, and I think of some friends from back in the day, where they did exactly what you said. They're like, we are not going to push you in one direction or another, but we're still going to keep talking to you even like through this process. Like they're not pushing you out of the community, and they, even though they don't know where you're going to land. And like that is exactly what I needed to hear. And like I remember all those things to today. And even though some of those things happened many, many years ago, but that sticks with me of like, I would want to do that to somebody else, because that's exactly what I needed to hear, of people who were not going to disown me because I had doubts or anything like that, but also had the confidence clearly in the actual Jesus that the power will show through at some point.
Yeah, like at some point we got to trust Jesus and the Holy Spirit to save people, change people, of like not, there's so much about like, I have to say, we as evangelicals, so who have you led to the Lord today, or who have you led to Christ? And I mean, yeah, it's great to share the news and whatever, but I think we take, at some point, I think that's kind of, I think it's God does the work. And the way that you lead people to Christ is just by like being like Christ, right? Is loving them, even if they don't deserve it, is being with them, is listening to them, is not pressuring them. And that's what the Spirit can move through, instead of, we're always trying to sell something, right? I don't know what, I don't know how Christianity became a pyramid scheme, but like that's what it is. It's just, you sell stuff, and then you can move up to be whatever the next leadership in the church is, to get more people to sell more stuff, to get more butts in the seat, to more thing. And anyway, it's garbage.
The irony, one of my friends at Mars Hill, and Doug, you remember this guy, was actually in a pyramid scheme and was one of my friends in that community group. The irony of seeing that in retrospect.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think, sort of in closing, in response to what you guys are saying, then the future of the church is going to be, or needs to be, making a space for these sorts of conversations. And as much as the future of the church is one of thriving, it's going to be making space for these sorts of conversations where we can ask questions, where there can be non-fearful responses, where we can engage substantively with each other and not be so worried about where people might end up. And so I think it's very possible that this deconstruction phenomenon that seems to be, a trend now, as much as we can observe that sort of thing, I think it's very possible that it becomes a very positive thing for the church in the US if it makes us into the kind of people that can have these sorts of conversations. And so I want to land the plane there, but there's plenty of other places I have wanted to go with you guys. So maybe we'll have another conversation and continue to try modeling this sort of dialogue. But thank you both for joining me today. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ralph.
Thank you.